Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So I want to pick up where we left off last week. I want us to continue to practice underlining, annotating, and asking questions. But this week we are taking the next step forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about advanced annotation, sort of taking our notes up a notch. And I also want to talk about some key concepts that we need to start looking for, asking questions about, and just generally thinking about anytime we read articles, book chapters, or any other texts that we might come across in this class. So I want to do two things today. First, I want to get you guys started on a couple of activities, couple of practice activities that you can do on your own. And then I want to cover a few new concepts that we will be covering this week. But the important thing to remember about all of these early skills that we're practicing, the underlining, the annotating, the questions, they are all designed to help us do things later. So the idea is to take notes, engage with the text that we read, be active readers, critical readers, in order for us to be able to do the work later that we need to do. So we've already seen a little bit of that with our first assignment, the Area 51 activity that we did for our first research journal. The reason I asked you guys to write a brief summary after doing all of the underlining, annotating, and asking questions is because that's the kind of work we're going to be doing in the future. It's not enough to just read these articles and jot down a few notes, maybe a few questions, underline some important words. That's all good, but we need to then do something with our findings, our ideas, and our notes. And generally what we're going to be doing with these texts, we're going to be summarizing them, sometimes in a formal, official way, other times just sort of briefly, informally for ourselves. And then we also need to respond to them. We need to have opinions that we can share about them. We need to either align ourselves with the authors or try to explain why we differ with the authors. This is the more advanced work that we need to do in 102. So all of the note-taking, all of these annotations and questions are simply designed to help us with our future summaries and responses. And eventually, of course, with the research paper. So again, today we're going to keep practicing, but then we're going to move to sort of the next level of annotation to get us ready to do some more advanced work. So the first thing I want you guys to do is take a look at the week 2 reading assignment, which is simply a PDF called Reading Sources Part 2. So we talked about Part 1 in the week 1 lecture. Now I want you to open up Part 2, which looks a lot like Part 1. It comes from the same textbook and it's the same type of PDF file. So open that up, and I want you to take a look on page 35. There's an essay by a journalist named James Surowiecki. And we're going to be using this guy a little bit. I want you guys to read this essay. So in a couple of moments, you can stop or pause this video, and I actually want you guys to go and do some work independently without any interference from me. And then when you're finished, you can come back and watch the rest of this lecture. So I actually want you to do two things with Surowiecki. First, read this essay. It's actually an excerpt from, I believe, a book that he wrote called The Wisdom of Crowds. So this is just a small piece from that larger work. So the essay begins at the very bottom of page 35, and it goes over to, I believe, the bottom of page 39. Yeah. So it's about 4 pages. It will take you a few minutes to read it. It's a pretty easy read, but I want you to pay attention to the examples that he's offering, and I want you to really try to grasp his meaning. He's talking about, well, the title kind of says it all. He is talking about the wisdom of crowds, how large groups of people can sort of figure stuff out and develop pretty efficient systems of behavior without really even talking amongst themselves about it. There's sort of this innate quality to large crowds. They can sometimes, those crowds can sometimes be actually in many ways intelligent. In interesting ways and kind of cooperative in interesting ways. So he's kind of exploring that. So Surowiecki's background is he used to be a financial journalist. I believe he used to work for, we have a little bio here. Oh yeah, Fortune magazine. They mentioned that. But he's also noteworthy, at least to me. I mean, I'm showing my age here, but he was somebody who was very interested early on in some of the potential, potential power of the internet. It's not like he helped to invent the internet or anything like that. And he wasn't like the first person to, broach some of these topics or issues. But there's a TED Talk by him that I also posted to the week 2 module. Once you have finished reading Wisdom of the Crowds, and of course as you're reading, practice all of those things we were doing last week, underlining, annotating, jot down a few questions. You might have some as you read, but once you're finished with all that, check out the TED Talk. It's not super long. I think it's under 20 minutes, somewhere in that neighborhood. Check it out when you have time. Try to watch the whole thing. You don't have to watch it all in one sitting, but try to get through that video when you have time this week. It's not, a huge assignment or anything. It's just practice. But Surowiecki in that video is talking about a lot of the same basic ideas and concepts that he explores in the essay. But the context is changing. So in the essay, he's mostly just discussing crowds and all of these different places like movie theaters, subways, college campus. But his focus is on the internet in that TED Talk. But he's still talking about crowds in many ways. He's talking about online crowds. And he's talking about some of the sort of potential and power of the internet as it appeared in the early 2000s. So that's what I want to sort of warn you about before you watch. Part of what I find interesting about this TED Talk, it is old, it's kind of dated. It's from either 2003 or maybe 2004. I might be off by a year or two, but it's in that first 5-year range of the 2000s, somewhere within the first 5 or 6 years of the century. And he's giving the TED Talk shortly after the catastrophic tsunamis that hit Thailand and Indonesia, Sri Lanka. Some of you might remember that event. I was in college when that happened. It was like 15, 16, maybe even 17 years ago. So if you're old enough, you might remember they were very devastating sort of, natural disasters. It was a huge typhoon, maybe I think it may have been earthquakes that caused the waves, but a lot of destruction. It was in the news, and he starts the TED Talk by discussing it, but he's not primarily focused on the tsunami. He wants to talk about how news of the tsunami was sort of disseminated through the internet, and how people who did not work officially as journalists but had blogs or websites back at this time, they were able to provide valuable information to a lot of people in those areas who were still in danger. People who were not sure what was going on. They had maybe lost contact with the outside world. They were afraid more waves were coming. Perhaps their area was flooded. They were trying to get out. A lot of people needed to get to a hospital. They were running out of supplies, whatever. So Surowiecki talks about that, and he's just very interested in the internet's potential to sort of give us an alternative means of acquiring information. And it does do that. But from our modern perspective, I think we can look at some of his ideas critically, because again, he's talking, 16, 17 years ago, sort of before the advent of modern social media. So that's one thing I like to point out to my students. When he's talking, Facebook either has not been invented or it is still very, very new. Zuckerberg's, still at Harvard or something. So he's talking kind of in almost a pre-modern internet environment, because he doesn't really address social media, but he does address blogs, and he's very interested in blogs. And that's a concept that we know. We still have blogs. I would argue they function a little bit differently in some cases now than they did in Surowiecki's time. But just check out the video. Again, we're just practicing, but what I actually want you guys to do as you're viewing the TED Talk, I want you to keep practicing our underlining, our annotating, and our asking questions. Remember, you can annotate a video just like you can annotate a written text. You can still take notes. Obviously, you can't underline when you're watching, but when you hear things, important ideas, key words, if you notice that he's repeating certain words, write those words down. If you hear a really important sentence that sounds like it could be a thesis, or at least it's a big idea, it's a big, important claim, write it down. Write down questions that you might have. If there's something that he says that you don't understand, write that down. And again, that's very possible because he's talking, once again, 15, 16, 17 years ago. So he might be referencing events or people that you don't recognize in some cases. You can always hop on your computer, do a quick Google search. I mean, you're already on your computer, I assume, as you're watching, but open up a new window and search for some of the terms that you don't know. You might want to visit, there's a pretty good Wikipedia page, I think, about those tsunamis, at least there used to be. I think it's still there. You might want to read that just to kind of brush up on that event if you're too young to remember it, which I'm guessing at least some of us are. So yeah, just practice. But what I want you to do after you finish reading his essay and after you finished watching the TED Talk, ask yourself, do I have a good grasp on these texts? Am I comfortable with my level of understanding of these texts? And what I want, if you have time, and I know I'm asking a lot here for this practice session, but when you're finished reading the essay, maybe jot down a brief summary of what you read based on your notes, based on your underlining, just like you did with the Storm Area 51 article. And then try to do the same thing after the TED Talk. Just jot down a brief, maybe 2 or 3 sentence summary based on your notes, and just kind of test yourself and jot down that summary, look back over it, and ask yourself, does that sound pretty accurate? Do I think I'm describing it pretty well? But again, you might still have some unanswered questions. So it's important to jot down questions, even if you can't answer them yet. You can always ask me, you can always do Google searches, or of course you might not follow up because this is not actually a real graded assignment. But I just want you guys to go through another practice round to make sure that you feel comfortable doing this kind of stuff. And if there's anything that isn't connecting, or if you have questions about any of this stuff, just email me. But again, Surowiecki is pretty easy to understand, but not 100%. I mean, he's definitely getting into some concepts that will be unfamiliar. And again, his stuff is kind of old, so you might not recognize all of his references. And this is good practice for what will come in the future, because once we start doing our own research, we're going to come across a wide variety of stuff. Some of the texts that you find will be very easy to understand. They'll be contemporary, current. You'll be fully on board from the start. But you're also going to find stuff like Surowiecki that, it's in English. You understand most of his words. He's not a super complex writer, but he's talking about subject matter that you might not be super familiar with. He's mentioning other authors, other sociologists, or other people who have commented on technology, people you might not know, some ideas that you might not know. And this is why we have to become more active, more critical readers, because the stuff that we read in 102 is often a little bit difficult, a little bit unfamiliar to us, at least at first. So we need to develop these strategies in order to help us when we confront these kinds of texts. So, like I said, go ahead and stop the video now, if you would. Go ahead and read the essay, and then, like I said, do all of our work while you're reading, and then brief summary, make sure you're comfortable with it, and then move on to the TED Talk and do all of the same things with the TED Talk. I'll wait. You can come back, and once you're finished with all that, let's go over the new concepts for week 2. Okay. So hopefully by now you've practiced with Surowiecki, both his essay and his TED Talk. So let's move on and talk a little bit more about advanced annotation and some things to look for, some ways to question the author. So I mentioned last week that to become critical readers, we have to ask questions, we have to engage, and sometimes that really amounts almost to us interrogating the author, trying to figure out certain things about the author, or simply asking important questions about the author and what the author is doing. So I love annotating, I love asking questions in the margins and underlining, but that stuff isn't really enough by itself. As we move into more advanced work, we have to start thinking more about thesis, intention, things like tone and bias. We have to start to sort of arrive at a larger understanding of the author and what the author is doing. So we have some terms here that I put in the week 2 overview. We're probably familiar with a lot of these terms, but let's run through them, make sure we have definitions for them, and I'll talk a little bit about why they're important. So, number 1, thesis. We already know why this is important. Obviously, the thesis is the overall argument or the statement of the text's purpose. Not everything we read will necessarily strike you as argumentative, though oftentimes the arguments are kind of hiding in plain sight, and I can always help you to uncover them if they're sort of hard to find. But not everything we read necessarily pushes an argument, but every article, every book, every source that you find, and everything that most of the things that I give you to read also will have some kind of larger purpose or point. And as the reader, as the critic, as the scholar, it is your responsibility to find it, understand it, and then to be able to discuss it, to be able to agree or disagree, to be able to talk about it intelligently, and ultimately respond to it in some way. So with some texts, the thesis is easy to find. In other cases, it might take some digging, it might take some work. But again, this is the central idea or the main argument of a text. So don't confuse the thesis with the topic. All right? So the topic of Surowiecki's essay is crowds, the behavior of large groups of people. That's his topic. That's his subject matter. That's what the article is about. But his argument, the larger point that he wants to make about crowds, is more specific and detailed. So it's related. Obviously, the thesis is related to the topic, but they're not the same. And sometimes students make that mistake. They think that the thesis simply means whatever the article is about. No, that's the topic. That's easy to identify. You can usually identify the topic of an article or an essay or a book chapter simply by looking at the title or perhaps reading the first few sentences. The thesis is a little, it's a little more specific typically, and not every author will have a thesis statement. They don't have to follow the same rules that we have to follow in school. So that's the challenge. Some authors are very transparent and they are very upfront with their thesis. They'll announce it in their intro paragraphs, just like we do. They'll be very obvious about it, but not everybody operates that way. So again, we have to look, we have to dig sometimes, but we always need to know what is the overall point or purpose or argument of this particular text. So obviously we can see why that's important. We can't do much else with a text until we identify the thesis. Next up is intention. And I want to talk about this a little bit because this might be a little bit new for us. So we're talking about the author's intention. What is the author trying to do? Why is the author trying to make the argument or the overall point that you just identified? So this can sometimes be a little bit tricky because different authors are doing different things. Sometimes it's pretty clear that authors want to persuade us. They want to make us think or feel certain things or certain ways. All right, but other times authors might be performing what we call a more informative sort of function. They are simply providing us with information so we can then make decisions or do other types of work. Some authors might be analyzing something. They might be interpreting some event or some other text. In some cases, there's a lot of different intentions. And again, sometimes they're clear and obvious. On other occasions, we have to look for them. We have to dig them up and put some real thought into them. So another thing that we need, are we always going to talk a lot about the author's intention? Maybe not. It depends. Not always, but it's just good information for you to have early on. So this is another thing to look for and think about as you're taking notes, as you're asking questions. You might want to ask yourself a question about the intention. What does the author want to accomplish here? Does the author simply want me to know things? Or does the author want me to accept a particular position in a particular debate? And that matters. Those are two very different things. So you need to know sort of what the author has in mind. And again, you can just sort of scribble it on your page or in the margins. You can, I don't know if you can see my copy of the Surawiki essay, but you see I'm annotating not just because that's the lesson, but because this is how I read, you know, not necessarily if I'm just like reading online or something, but when I'm reading important stuff, I underline, I annotate. So again, as you're doing that work, start thinking about intention along with all these other things that we're covering. So let's move on to bias. Another thing that might come up later or it might not. But if you have some notes about it, you can decide at a future date, do I actually want to talk about bias? This is important with your sources because sometimes you might recognize clear bias in one of your sources and you might need to address it or acknowledge it in a future assignment. But you might not. So just because you write some of these notes down, it doesn't mean that you have to pursue them later. But if you do need to, you can. You're covering all your bases because you're jotting down some ideas and you're at least identifying all of these key elements. So if you need to go back later and do more work with them, you can. So all bias means is a preconceived prejudice or preference. And it's kind of impossible to be totally unbiased. I would argue that all humans have a certain degree of subjectivity, so we're always going to be a little bit biased. But a lot of journalism, at least, strives for objectivity, trying to be neutral. Again, does it succeed all the time? Probably not. But as you're researching, you don't have to strictly find unbiased sources. You just need to be aware of the bias that does exist in some of your sources. So you need to be able to tell if your authors are biased. Are they presenting balanced information? Are they sort of giving equal coverage to both sides of a debate? Or do they clearly have some skin in the game? Are they clearly on one side or the other, and they're trying to bring you, the reader, over to their side? That's what you sort of have to figure out. And sometimes when we're thinking about bias, it can pay if we know a little bit about the author's background. We don't need to be, an expert, but even just little blurbs like the one we get about Surowiecki at the beginning of his essay, those are useful, right? Because we at least know what Surowiecki's background is. We know he's a journalist who's written about technology and finance. So we can maybe see how he's come around to getting so interested in crowds and the internet. And if you watch the TED Talk, you'll notice that he's especially interested in how the internet is sort of a go-around. It kind of avoids conventional, sort of traditional journalism, which again, I think matters to him because he is a journalist, or he was. So he's interested in how people can sort of spread news on the internet without relying on traditional news organs. And we can relate to that because that's still very much a thing today. It's much more of a thing. Like Surowiecki thinks it's super cool and new. Now it's kind of commonplace for people to get their news from non-traditional news sources on the internet. But again, knowing a little bit about Surowiecki, at least knowing that he's a journalist, can help us to kind of better navigate his essay and certainly his TED Talk. So I gave you another example in the overview. Let's say you find an article written by some U.S. Department of Agriculture guy, some scientist who works for that government agency, and he's writing an article about, what did I say? It was about like fast food. Yeah. If he's again, I know we don't all trust the government necessarily. That's my phone ringing. Sorry, let me hang up on whoever this is. If we know that he works for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we can typically trust his research and his findings. I know we don't always trust government agencies, but typically we can rely on his information, and we can sort of view him as relatively unbiased if he's writing from the perspective of a government employee, simply talking about pros and cons of fast food consumption. However, if we learn that he is now working for a consulting firm specializing in agribusiness, meaning they sell a lot of their products to fast food restaurants, now he has a real stake in this game. Now he seems less objective. And if he's telling us, hey, eating fast food's really not that bad, and we know what he does for a living, we know that maybe he used to work for the U.S. DA, but now he's working for some private business that sells their stuff to fast food, now we might think of his bias as potentially mattering. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to throw out his article. We can still use it. If there's good info in that article, we can still use it, but we might need to acknowledge that this guy might be a little bit biased. So that's the kind of move that we want to make. So if we can just know what the author does for a living, where does the author work? Is the author sort of working on behalf of some organization or a school or a business? Do they have maybe some incentive to get us to think a certain way or to get the readers to do a certain thing? Again, even if the answers are yes, that still might be a valuable source, but you just need to know that there is some bias at work that might affect the overall accuracy or the overall picture that they are painting. All right, so I'll try to speed up here. Tone, again, I explain all of this in the overview, but the main thing to remember about tone is, and this is a distinction that we'll be talking about throughout the semester, but there's a major difference between what we call academic sources on one hand and what we call popular sources on the other hand. And you'll often notice a difference in tone, among other differences. So academic sources tend to be longer, they're more dense, they're more complex, and they often have what we can best describe as maybe an academic or a professional tone, which means the word choice might be a little more elevated, the sentence structure might be a little bit more complex, the ideas might be a little more difficult to grasp. You'll also notice, again, longer, more research typically being done in academic sources. So again, you might not end up doing a whole lot with tone, but it's just good information to have, at least in the form of a few annotations. So again, I'm encouraging you guys to maybe take a few notes on each one of these big key concepts. So with a lot of academic sources, we might consider the tone to be kind of dry. Some students would say dull, boring, sort of professorial. Again, a lot of these articles are written by professors, scholars, scientists, doctors, people who are experts in their fields. So you can just notice that. But with popular sources, there's going to be a more wide range of tones. Popular sources include, newspapers, magazines, even some websites, still news oriented, but they're really written for a general audience. They're not necessarily intended for upper level students or professionals in the field. They're just written for, anybody who's literate and might be interested in the topic. So with popular sources, you might sometimes find kind of funny tones. You might find angry tones. The academic stuff doesn't typically have as much anger or humor because they're trying to be objective. They're often focusing more on facts, research, objective reality. But popular sources are going to come from all over the place. Some are going to be angry. Some are funny. Some are hopeful. Some are sarcastic or whatever. So with that Area 51 article, for example, to me, the tone of that piece that appeared in a news magazine, I think it was in The Atlantic, maybe originally, I'm not sure, but something like that, a newspaper or a news magazine, the tone I found was kind of lighthearted. The author was I thought was kind of having fun with the event, and sort of with some of the people even. And some students actually found the tone to be slightly offensive, like maybe the author was kind of making fun of some of these people in small town Nevada and sort of making fun of the whole event and the whole thing and just kind of, laughing at it. Some people perceive that. Other people think he's just kind of enjoying himself. And, but there is some humor at work, whether it lands or not. The author is at least trying to be funny. And no, he's not taking the whole thing very seriously, I don't think. So we might call his tone lighthearted or humorous or even a little bit sarcastic perhaps at times. But that's a very different tone from what you might find from a different article or a different text that might be tackling a really controversial issue or a terrible tragedy. There's going to be a more somber, serious approach to topics like those. So again, this might not come up later, but it might. You might want to talk about tone when you're responding to some of your sources. Some of the tones might turn you off. Some authors' tones might make you angry. And that's stuff that you can talk about later if you think it's relevant. And then finally, audience. I've already covered a lot of this because when you're thinking about audience, it's important to think about that distinction I was just describing in relation to tone. The difference between academic sources and popular sources. Academic sources tend to be targeted at very specialized audiences. People like me, people who work in higher education, again, scientists, doctors, experts in the field, and also you guys, advanced students, college students, or graduate students. That's a pretty small audience, though, in the grand scheme of things, right? Popular sources are not targeted at a specialized audience. They are targeted for a general audience. So that, like I just said, that means anybody really who's not a child and can read is basically part of the intended audience for a popular source. Now, not everybody wants to read about the news, but in terms of the level of difficulty and the length, popular sources are really geared for people who, they're not experts. They don't want to spend all day reading the thing. They're just interested. They can sit down and read an article in 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes and then move on with their life. So it's important to know the differences between popular sources and academic sources. So a quick couple of notes about intended audience is a good thing to have for later. And you can ask yourself, am I part of the intended audience? Because sometimes, as 102 students, you might come across sources that really seem to be written for like graduate students or law students or students in med school or something. And you might think, yeah, I'm not really the target audience. And even if you're not, that's okay. You can still use it, or you can decide not to use it because you're not comfortable as a result of not being in that target audience. So again, it can help you with the selection process when you're researching, and it can be another thing that you discuss at a future date. All right, so again, this is kind of the next level of annotation. And if you're taking good notes, you should always be able to summarize and respond to what you just read. Those are kind of the benchmarks for us. And we're going to be working more on summarizing in the weeks to come, coming up soon. But you should always be able to do what you did with the Area 51 piece. After you're finished, you should be able to write that brief summary and then just have some opinions, have some ideas ready for a potential response. All right, so let's cover the evidence stuff very quickly, and then I will sign off. So we're going to talk a lot more about evidence over the next few weeks, but I just want to give you a few major types so you can start looking for these in, say, the stuff that we've already read and the stuff that we're going to be reading later this week and next week and beyond. So you can go back to the Surowiecki essay and TED Talk and maybe look for some of these types of evidence. So I'm going to later refer to a lot of these as inartistic appeals. I'm not going to explain what that means just yet. I just want you to get familiar with hearing those words. Next week, we're talking about appeals, and these are inartistic, also largely considered kind of hard evidence. These are the things that you will often find through your research. So I mentioned facts and statistics. We're talking about hard numbers here. We can consider this to be kind of numerical evidence. And these kinds of figures or stats are often pretty reliable. We like those. I also include surveys and polls. So these are like opinions or answers from some kind of representative sample of the population. So we kind of know how surveys and polls work. They're not as reliable as facts and statistics. And as we know, if we followed, the recent presidential race, like polls are not always accurate. They're just sort of projections a lot of times. And they're not 100% or even close to 100% accurate. Not everybody really views surveys and polls as being reliable, but they can at least provide some info. They can at least give us sort of a snapshot. So like if you wanted to sort of figure out how the student body at GBC felt about a particular issue, you could conduct a survey where maybe you asked 100 students a set of questions and then you compiled their answers and then said, look, the majority of students feel the following way. That would have some weight, but as we know, that's only 100 students out of like 2,500 total. So you might not capture the whole thing, but you can at least provide some degree of evidence. Also, examples are very good. We're going to talk more about examples a lot more throughout the semester. These are just single representative instances that serve to support larger points that you're making, or your larger overall argument. So we're going to use a lot of examples, and then I mentioned anecdotes, which are just extended examples that are usually in narrative form. We like narratives. Humans learn best when information is presented to us in narrative form. So we like those, and again, they're used to support your larger points. And then finally, expert opinions. We can also call these appeals to authority. I want you to notice that Surowiecki uses this particular method. He's talking about other scholars, other writers who have done work in these areas that he's exploring. So again, this means that you're really relying on your research. You're finding sources, you're finding other thinkers, other people who have worked on this stuff, and you're ultimately going to be summarizing some of what they say. You might even directly quote some of these experts at times, and you're going to use some of their findings in your future work. So start looking for those things. We can start evaluating some of these texts that we read based on the kinds of evidence they're using, based on their tone, based on potential bias, based on the overall argument they're making, and the intention that they seem to have, their larger sort of purpose. What are they trying to make us do? The more you know, the more you'll be able to work with these and understand these texts. And that's, of course, the ultimate goal. All right, so that's it for week 2. In week 3, next week, we're going to continue to discuss evidence. And I'm going to sort of cover artistic appeals and inartistic appeals, like some of those types of evidence that we just went through. So next week is going to be all about evidence, how we can use it and how we can find it and read it in the sources that we discover for ourselves. And then by week 4, we're going to really start talking about research topics. So before I go, let me just remind you that you need to start thinking about what you might like to choose as your own research paper topic. Remember, we are going to be working with the same topic throughout the semester. So by week 4, I'm going to expect everyone to have a topic selected. And I'll have a list that you can choose from posted by next week, week 3. But you don't have to choose anything on my list. You can come up with your own. Eventually, you're going to need to run it by me. But by week 4, I at least want you to have an idea, a plan in place, and then we can talk about it more. All right, so have a good week. I'll see you in the week 3 lecture.